Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how strength training differs from hypertrophy training and how we can manipulate our program to preference each adaptation. First and foremost, let's cover what hypertrophy is. Hypertrophy in the most simple sense refers to an increase in the size of the muscle. However, there are a few different types of hypertrophy that may contribute to muscle growth. Let's now cover what these are. The first form of hypertrophy we have is myofibrillar hypertrophy. This is when we see an increase in the amount of contractile muscle tissue in the muscle fibers themselves. So basically the muscle increases in thickness as a result of more total actin and myosin filaments. Muscles can also hypertrophy in length as well as thickness, but this is not really relevant for this video. Myofibrillar hypertrophy is probably what contributes the most to increases in muscle size, and for the most part is what we are referring to when talking about hypertrophy. However, we may also see another form of hypertrophy occurring, which is termed sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. We still don't fully understand how or to what extent this occurs, and whether this is an actual adaptation or a temporary mechanism which may trigger myofibrillar hypertrophy. However, the theory is that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is an increase in the size of the muscle cells via expansion of the sarcoplasm, or in other words, the cell space around the actual myofibrils. This would mean the muscle would get bigger, but not necessarily stronger, because there was no actual change in the contractile tissue. This is one mechanism thought to explain why bodybuilders often have much bigger muscles, but aren't as strong as strength athletes, like weightlifters and powerlifters, relative to body weight. However, when training for hypertrophy, trainers generally want to look more muscular, so it doesn't really matter whether this sarcoplasmic hypertrophy occurs or not, because ultimately it still results in a bigger looking muscle. Furthermore, we don't even know how we would be able to train specifically for sarcoplasmic versus myofibrillar hypertrophy, so it is practically useless to consider anyway. Another potential contributor to increases in muscle size is hyperplasia. Once again, we don't fully understand if this really occurs in human muscle tissue or not, or to what extent this occurs. However, this theory suggests that there may potentially be an increase in the number of muscle fibers in the muscle, not only an increase in the size. If this was to occur, it would mean more total muscle fibers, and therefore more growth potential to make the muscle bigger. Regardless, when we train for hypertrophy, we only really care about the physical appearance, so it doesn't really matter anyway for these trainees. And even if this is a real occurrence, we don't know how to specifically induce it, making it practically useless until we learn more. So now that we understand what hypertrophy is, let's now cover some fundamental principles of how to best train for it. Let's now explore some of the most important variables that contribute to hypertrophy and how they can be manipulated to maximize muscle growth. Without going into too much detail, proximity to failure is one of the most important variables for hypertrophy training. We generally want to take each set fairly close to failure to ensure all muscle fibers are recruited and trained. As a general rule, we probably want to take each set somewhere between 0 to 3 reps in reserve. For heavy compound lifts, we can probably take sets a little further from failure and still get a similar hypertrophy response, while lighter isolation lifts need to be taken closer to failure to ensure the highest threshold motor units are recruited. Therefore, a general rule would be to take each set around 1 to 3 reps in reserve for compound lifts in the 6 to 12 rep range, and around 0 to 2 reps in reserve for isolation lifts in the 12 to 20 plus range. This leads us to the next variable for hypertrophy training, which is rep ranges and load. It is now well established that hypertrophy can be equally achieved across a spectrum of different rep ranges and loads when sets are taken close enough to failure. This is because, like we mentioned, when sets are taken close to failure, all motor units are recruited and all muscle fibers are trained. However, we know that very heavy loads of around 5 reps and below are probably inferior for muscle growth, and very light loads around 40 plus reps per set are also inferior for muscle growth. Therefore, a good practical recommendation would be to train within the 6 to 20 rep range. Then, based on the exact exercise you implement, the rep ranges can be adjusted to suit its demands. Generally, compound lifts are better suited to using heavier loads with lower rep ranges, while isolation lifts are better suited to higher rep ranges with lighter loads. And the last important variable for hypertrophy training is volume. For hypertrophy training, volume is best quantified using the number of sets performed per muscle group per week. This is because hypertrophy can be equally achieved using a range of different rep ranges and loads, and also using a range of different exercises for the same muscle group. This means that the classic volume load, which refers to sets times reps times load, is probably not as useful as using number of sets. Volume seems to have a dose-response relationship with muscle growth, meaning more volume results in more growth. Therefore, trainees should probably try to maximize how much volume they can train with within their recovery abilities and their practical limitations. Now that we have covered the fundamentals of hypertrophy training, let's explore strength. First, we need to establish what exactly strength is. Strength in a practical sense refers to how much weight a trainee can lift with a specific exercise. So rather than a structural adaptation like hypertrophy, strength is a performance outcome. Now, something we need to remember is that unlike hypertrophy, strength is specific. So while hypertrophy can be achieved using different exercises and different rep ranges, strength is specific to what we train for. Let's now cover what adaptations contribute to increasing how much weight we can lift. The first contributor to strength is structural adaptations. There are a few structural adaptations that contribute to strength, but the most notable is hypertrophy. Like we discussed earlier in the video, myofibrillar hypertrophy results in an increase in contractile elements of the muscle fiber. This means that we have more total amount of contractile tissue that can contribute to force production. So this doesn't mean that once trainees increase muscle size, they automatically become stronger, but it increases the potential to become stronger. However, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, if it actually occurs to any significant extent, won't directly contribute to strength gains because this is not a contractile element. So with the muscle mass that a trainee has, they can also become stronger without increasing muscle size due to neural efficiency. Trainees can become more efficient at recruiting all muscle fibers and maximizing how much force each fiber can produce. While structural adaptations are non-specific, neural adaptations are. This means we need to practice the exercise we want to become stronger at with heavy loads to actually maximize neural efficiency. Furthermore, being strong at one lift doesn't necessarily mean you will be equally strong at another lift. And the last primary adaptation that contributes to strength is skill practice. This is also a neural adaptation, although it refers more to learning the most biomechanically efficient technique to use. Trainees can become more efficient by adjusting grip width, foot stance, limb positions and more to find the technique that allows them to lift the most weight. Furthermore, skill practice can minimize unnecessary movements that result in suboptimal force production. For example, a trainee can learn to brace their trunk properly to make force transfer into the barbell more efficient during a squat. Skill practice is once again specific to the exercise, so trainees need to practice the exercise they want to get stronger at with heavy loads to become more skilled at that specific lift. So how do we train for strength? Well, there are two primary training methods that contribute to strength gain, which are related to how strength is expressed. First is skill practice. Trainees need to practice the lift they want to get stronger at some point. This will maximize the neural adaptations required to express strength. Skill practice is best achieved by training with heavy loads in the specific exercise that you want to get stronger at. This doesn't mean trainees need to perform 1 rep max attempts all year round, but when they want to be at their strongest, the specific exercise needs to be trained with heavy loads to maximize performance. Another training adaptation that will contribute to strength gain is muscle growth. Like we discussed, muscle growth increases the potential for maximal strength. This is also likely the primary contributor to long-term strength gains over time. If we never increase muscle size, then there is only so much contractile tissue to become neurally efficient with. Therefore, a plateau will probably be reached at some point, and further strength gains probably need to come from increases in muscle size of the prime movers for that exercise. We have already discussed how to best train for muscle hypertrophy earlier in the video, so we won't cover it again. Now that we have covered the basic theory behind strength and hypertrophy training, let's now cover how to practically write a program for each quality. Before we explore the details of programming, we should first understand that there is no right or wrong way to create a program. There are infinite different ways to write a training program, and this will differ when we consider factors like training age, context, training goals, and individual variation. Therefore, for this video, we will just use some example programs to provide a basic idea of how a program can be created. First, let's start with programming for hypertrophy training. First, we need to establish the basic mesocycle structure. A mesocycle generally refers to a block of training consisting of multiple overloading weeks and one deload. We won't go into detail about overloading training versus deload training, but the basic idea is that overloading training has the goal of inducing adaptations, while the deload is simply there to reduce fatigue while maintaining adaptation. The deload can be implemented at the start or end of the mesocycle, and it doesn't really matter because one mesocycle will follow the next anyway. Generally, a mesocycle lasts anywhere between 3 to 6 weeks, with more advanced trainees generally requiring more frequent deloads compared with novices. For this example program, let's use a 4-week mesocycle consisting of 1 deload week at the start of the mesocycle and the next 3 weeks being overloading training. Next, we need to establish the basic training split, or in other words, what muscle groups are trained on what days. The training split doesn't really make much of a difference for hypertrophy training because it is more a way of distributing volume throughout the week rather than an individual variable itself. As long as total weekly volume is equated, the training split makes little difference for muscle growth. However, if possible, we ideally want to try and hit all muscle groups at least twice per week, as this seems to be slightly more beneficial than training each muscle group only once per week. For this example, let's simply use a 4-day upper-lower split, with the upper body being trained on days 1 and 3, and the lower body being trained on days 2 and 4. Now we need to select exercises for each day. For hypertrophy training, there are many effective exercises to train each muscle group. Therefore, trainees can implement the exercises that they prefer the most to train each muscle group. For this example, we have implemented the following exercises on each day. As we can see, we are hitting the full upper body on days 1 and 3, and the full lower body on days 2 and 4. We can also see that the emphasis slightly shifts for some muscle groups between days. Day 1 has more exercises for the chest, while day 3 has more exercises for the back. And day 2 has more exercises for the quads, while day 4 has more exercises for the glutes and hamstrings. Next, let's implement volume for each exercise. As we mentioned, volume is going to be quantified using the number of sets per muscle group per week. Volume can be evenly distributed across all muscle groups, or it can be adjusted based on what muscle groups trainees want to emphasize and what muscle groups they aren't as concerned with developing. For this example, let's use a fairly standard amount of volume for each muscle group. As we can see, we have prescribed a standard 3 to 4 sets for each exercise. This gives us a total of 12 weekly sets for the chest and back, 6 direct sets for the shoulders, biceps and triceps, 9 sets for the quads and hamstrings, and 6 direct sets for the calves. We can also see that in the first week, which is the deload, the volume has been reduced by around 1/2 to 2/3 of the regular overloading volume to reduce fatigue. The next variable to implement is proximity to failure. This can be quantified in a program using the reps in reserve system, which is an indicator of how many reps the trainee had left in the set before failure. Reps in reserve don't have to be prescribed to the exact number, a rough range can be described instead. As we can see here, the heavy compound lifts like back squat and stiff leg deadlift have been prescribed a reps in reserve of 2 to 3 because they will use the heaviest loads and are the most fatiguing. The other compound lifts like dumbbell presses, cable rows and pull-ups have been prescribed with a reps in reserve of around 1 to 2 because they are more fatiguing than the isolation lifts, but not as fatiguing as squats and deadlifts. And the isolation lifts can be taken around 0 to 1 reps in reserve for each set because they are not very systemically fatiguing and are generally performed with higher rep ranges. And the last step to completing this program is to know what rep ranges and loads will be used. This doesn't need to actually be prescribed, rather trainees can record how many reps they perform and what loads they used. This is because we can't predict how many reps a trainee can perform with a given weight. Furthermore, rep ranges and load will change from set to set because of fatigue. For example, a trainee may perform 12 reps for their first set of a flat dumbbell press, and then perform 11, 10, and 9 reps in the following sets respectively. This is due to fatigue that accumulates throughout the session. So rather than prescribing rep ranges and loads, trainees should find a rep range that suits the exercise within the 6 to 20 range, and record exactly how many reps were performed with each set and with what load. Changes in performance can then be monitored over time to assess progress. This leads us onto the next programming consideration, progressive overload. As we can see with this program, there is no progressive overload applied in the traditional sense. This is because trainees will simply progress naturally at their own rate by going through the program. If each set is taken to the appropriate reps in reserve, then hypertrophy adaptation should take place, and trainees should improve rep performance and load lifted over time. This may occur from week to week for novice trainees, but it may take multiple months to see notable progress for more advanced lifters. Now that we have covered the fundamentals of programming for hypertrophy training, let's cover how to program for strength. For the most part, a strength program will look similar to a hypertrophy program, except strength training needs to involve the specific lifts the trainee wants to get stronger at. This is because hypertrophy is still an important component of driving strength gains, but it doesn't account for the neural adaptations induced by specific skill practice. The mesocycle structure follows the same concept as hypertrophy training. We want a deload every 3 to 6 weeks to reduce fatigue and allow more productive training. So for this example, let's use the same 4-week mesocycle structure, which includes a deload for the first week and overloading training for the following 3 weeks. The training split is also similar between strength and hypertrophy training. The only additional consideration for strength training is that we probably want to structure our program in a way that allows us to be in a fresh state to perform well. So we need to make sure we have enough time between performing the specific strength lifts so that one doesn't interfere with another. For example, trainees would probably want to avoid squatting and deadlifting on consecutive days, as these lifts will likely have residual fatigue that will impact each other. For this example, we can pretty much use the same training split as before, training both the upper and lower body twice per week. Next, we have exercise selection. This is where the two programs will differentiate slightly. Because we want to practice a specific skill for strength training, we need to include the exercises we want to get stronger at. So let's say for this example, this trainee wants to get stronger at the power lifts, i.e. the squat, bench press, and deadlift. So these are our primary strength lifts, and then other exercises can be used as accessory lifts for muscle growth. So as we can see in this example, we have taken the same exercises as the previous hypertrophy program, except we've replaced the dumbbell presses with the barbell bench press, the back squat remains the same, and the stiff leg deadlift has been replaced with the conventional deadlift. This allows the trainee to include the specific strength lifts, while still including accessory exercises to drive muscle growth. Volume follows the same principles as our previous program too, however the limitations of strength training may be greater. The strength lifts are generally more overall fatiguing, which means trainees probably can't tolerate as much volume of these lifts compared with other less taxing exercises. This means trainees may not be able to perform as much total weekly volume, or at least may have to reduce volume of the strength lifts. In this example program, we have kept volume exactly the same for all exercises, except we have reduced the volume of the strength lifts by 1 set in each session. And like our hypertrophy program, the volume has been reduced in week 1 because this is the deload week. And the last variables for our strength training program are proximity to failure, rep ranges, and load. For the accessory lifts, these variables can remain the same as our hypertrophy program. However, for the strength lifts, they may change depending on when they want to peak. Therefore, we need to discuss the concept of periodization before prescribing these variables. Periodization can be an entire topic in itself, but the basic concept is that there are times of the year when we need to perform at our best and times when we don't. We may want to peak for a competition if you're a strength athlete, or this may just be a random time you want to test your strength. Either way, trainees cannot be at their absolute strongest all year round. Generally speaking, further from a trainee's peak, the focus should be on muscle growth, and closer to when they need to peak, the emphasis should be on neural adaptations. This will build foundational muscle mass first, which can then be trained to become neurally efficient when we need to peak. Therefore, we can manipulate proximity to failure, rep ranges, and load to alter the emphasis over time. So a hypertrophy-focused strength program may involve higher rep ranges with lighter loads and a closer proximity to failure for the strength lifts. In a program like this, the strength lifts would basically just be treated the same as accessory lifts. In a more strength-focused program, the strength lifts may use lower rep ranges and a slightly further proximity to failure to emphasize skill practice and neural adaptations. So here we can see that the rep ranges remain the same, while proximity to failure slightly increases throughout the mesocycle. And a peaking strength program may use lower volumes, very low rep ranges, and close proximities to failure to maximize neural adaptations and minimize fatigue. This would allow trainees to perform the most specific training in a fresh state to lift at their best. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.